Malaysia Airlines flight with 239 people on board, including 4 Americans, has gone missing.
Malaysia's government says that 2 more pieces of debris discovered in South Africa are almost certainly from Flight 370.
Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 vanished from radar screens on March 8, 2014. The Boeing 777 carried 239 people and disappeared during its flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. Search teams launched an international effort that became the most expensive and complex underwater search in aviation's history. Well, after 11 years, 11 long, silent, haunting years, scientists finally got their hands on something hidden. We're talking about classified-level bizarre. So grab a drink, silence the group chat, and lean in, because by the time we get to the end of this video, you're gonna see MH370 in a whole new light. The day MH370 vanished. It was just a day like any other day. You're on a regular overnight flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. You get comfy, settle in, maybe put on a movie, or start dozing off, expecting to wake up in a new country, new time zone, probably ready for business meetings, reunions, or just a little adventure. That's what 239 people thought they were in for on March 8, 2014, when they boarded Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. It was supposed to be just a routine 6-hour trip, nothing dramatic. Just take off, fly through the night, land, and carry on with life. But instead, it became one of the greatest mysteries the aviation world has ever seen. And honestly, after all these years, it still gives people goosebumps just thinking about how a whole plane, like a massive Boeing 777, could just vanish into thin air like that. I mean, how does that even happen? In this day and age? For 11 long years, the world has asked the same question over and over again. What really happened to Flight MH370? Families waited, experts guessed, theories piled up, but no one could say for sure until now. Stick around until the very end, because this mystery has just been cracked open, and the truth might leave you speechless. So here's how it all started. The plane took off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport at 12:41 a.m. It was cruising smoothly, like completely normal, nothing unusual, just your regular nighttime flight gliding over the South China Sea. Then at 1:07 a.m., its ACRs, basically the system that sends data about the plane to the airline, sends out what would be its final message before someone, and we still don't know who, switched it off. And just like that, poof, silence. But wait, it gets even weirder. At 1:19 a.m., the captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah, makes what seems to be a super chill routine call to air traffic control. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Nothing alarming in his tone, no hint of distress. It sounded like a perfectly normal handoff between flight control zones. But then, just 2 minutes later, at 1:21 a.m., the plane's transponder goes completely dark, right as they were about to enter Vietnamese airspace. Creepy, right? Now, this is where things start to twist into a full-on thriller movie. You'd think the plane would just keep heading northeast toward China, but nope. Military radar picks up this shocking move. It turns around, not slightly, not by accident. It makes a sharp U-turn, cuts back across the Malay Peninsula, then veers northwest over the Strait of Malacca. Like, what? That's not just a detour, that's a whole new direction, and no one knows why. The military keeps tracking it until 2:22 a.m., and then nothing. The radar contact is gone, vanished over the Andaman Sea, about 200 nautical miles northwest of Penang Island. But here's the crazy part. Even though the transponder and all official communication had gone dark, this satellite system called Inmarsat kept picking up hourly pings from the plane. Not conversations, not flight data, just these ghostly little signals, kind of like the plane saying, "Hey, I'm still here," every hour. The last one came in at 8:11 a.m., almost 7 hours after the world lost contact. Let that sink in. 7 hours. That's a long time for a plane to be flying completely off the grid. There was even one final attempt from the aircraft to connect to the satellite at 8:19 a.m., which experts think probably happened just as the engines were dying and the plane was about to meet the ocean. Now you'd think, with something this massive happening, the response would be instant, right? Like alarms blaring, search teams scrambled, international support rolling in within the hour. But sadly, no. The whole initial response was messy, slow, and honestly heartbreaking. Malaysia Airlines didn't even release a public statement until 7:24 a.m., almost 6 hours after the plane lost contact. And by then, the flight should have already landed in Beijing. Families were waiting, people were pacing in airport terminals, and no one had any answers. And it wasn't just the airline dragging its feet. Air traffic control was all over the place. When MH370 didn't check in as scheduled, Ho Chi Minh controllers waited a full 20 minutes before even alerting Malaysia. Protocols said they should have done it in 5. Then Malaysia Airlines made it worse by giving out wrong info, saying the plane was last seen over Cambodia, when in reality, that was just its projected route, not where it actually was. That confusion cost them over an hour to clear up. And Kuala Lumpur didn't send out an official distress signal until 5 hours and 13 minutes after that final radio call from the cockpit. 5 hours. Can you imagine how much ground that plane could have covered in that time? The real kicker: the initial search teams were looking in completely the wrong place. Everyone was scouring the South China Sea, not realizing the plane had turned west. Why? Because military officials had that radar data showing the westward turn, but they didn't hand it over to the civilian search crews until nearly 20 hours later. 20 hours. Just imagine how different things might have been if that info had been shared right away. It's like, why sit on something so crucial? And if all that wasn't enough chaos for one day, reports started pouring in that turned out to be false leads. There were oil slicks spotted, debris seen floating. None of it was from MH370. Then the head of Malaysia's Air Force confused everybody by saying the plane had been tracked all the way to the Malacca Strait. And then later, he denied saying that at all. Like, huh? It felt like every answer led to more questions, and nobody could get their story straight. It wasn't until March 15th, a full week later, that experts started using satellite data to analyze possible flight paths. Turns out, there were two. One headed north toward Kazakhstan, and the other south into the vast, empty stretch of the Indian Ocean. Talk about terrifying. The search area suddenly ballooned into this giant expanse that covered more ocean than anyone had expected. It was like trying to find a needle in 10 haystacks, all drifting in different directions. Then came the heartbreaking moment on March 24th. Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak made a public announcement confirming what many had feared. Based on all the analysis and satellite data, they believed the plane had crashed into the southern Indian Ocean, about 2,500 kilometers southwest of Australia. And just like that, the fate of all 239 souls on board was sealed. Gone. No survivors, no final calls, no wreckage yet found, just silence, and an ocean that refused to give up its secrets. This whole tragedy exposed so many flaws in how aviation authorities handle emergencies. The delays, the confusion, the lack of coordination. It all added insult to injury for the families who were already suffering beyond words. Can you imagine being one of those families, knowing your loved one was on that flight and watching the search go in circles for days, knowing they might never even find the plane, let alone bring closure? The first search missions and their failures. So it all began on March 8, 2014, when Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 took off from Kuala Lumpur, heading to Beijing like it was just another routine flight. But somewhere over the South China Sea, it just vanished. No mayday, no distress signal, just poof, gone. And by the next morning, March 9th, the real chaos began. That's when the search officially kicked off, and from the get-go, things were already a mess. The Kuala Lumpur Aeronautical Rescue Coordination Center didn't even get moving until 5:30 a.m., and that was more than 4 hours after they lost contact with the plane. Can you imagine? 4 hours in a situation like that is an eternity. That delay alone was a huge red flag, and honestly, just the first in a long line of frustrating missteps that would plague the entire search. And get this, they were looking in the completely wrong place at first. The teams poured all their efforts into the South China Sea, which made sense at first because, well, that's where the plane should have been if things had gone normally. But spoiler alert, things did not go normally. It turns out the plane had turned westward, and that crucial detail actually showed up on military radar not too long after it vanished. The only problem? That information didn't even make it to the civilian search teams until like 20 hours later. 20 hours! Can you believe that? All that time wasted scouring the wrong waters while the real trail was going cold fast. Still, the world pulled together in a way that was honestly kind of beautiful. By the end of that first day, March 9th, there were already 40 aircraft and over 20 vessels from multiple countries searching tirelessly. And it didn't stop there. Things escalated quickly. At its peak, the operation had 26 countries involved, sending nearly 60 ships and 50 aircraft. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone felt this tragedy in their bones. Then, about a week later, on March 17th, Australia stepped in to take charge of the search efforts, especially since new satellite data showed the plane had likely flown south and ended up somewhere deep in the southern Indian Ocean, like way out there, in one of the most remote and unforgiving parts of the planet. It was heartbreaking. Then on March 24th, Malaysia's Prime Minister came forward and made it official. Experts had analyzed the data and concluded that MH370 had crashed into the ocean, and there were no survivors. Can you imagine being one of the families hearing that? Just absolutely gut-wrenching. After that, the search became even more intense. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority took the lead and carried out a massive surface search that went on for 50 days, until April 28, 2014. They covered something like 4.6 million square kilometers of ocean. I mean, just try to wrap your head around that. And yet, despite all that effort, not one single piece of solid evidence turned up. Not even a suitcase, not a seat cushion, nothing. It was like looking for a needle in the world's biggest haystack, except they weren't even sure they were in the right haystack to begin with. So, when that didn't work, they had to switch things up and go underwater. This meant deploying high-tech autonomous underwater vehicles and using some of the most advanced sonar equipment available. They were literally scanning the ocean floor, trying to piece together any clue they could find. It was slow, expensive, and emotionally draining for everyone involved, but no one wanted to give up. In May 2014, things got even more official. Malaysia, China, and Australia came together and signed a tripartite agreement to work hand in hand on the search. That's when the Joint Agency Coordination Center, also known as JACI, was formed to handle all the logistics and keep things organized. And let me tell you, coordinating an international search of that size and complexity, that's no joke. It was like running a small country out in the middle of the ocean. What's wild is that even with all that cooperation and all those resources, it still took years, and they still didn't find definitive answers. Just think about that for a second. All that time, all that money, all that technology, and the ocean still kept her secrets. People around the world were glued to the updates, hoping for a breakthrough, praying for closure. Families of the passengers clung to hope, even as months turned into years. And every little possible lead, a washed-up piece of debris, a strange signal, a new satellite image, would send everyone into a frenzy, only to end in more disappointment. The MH370 search faced unique challenges that explained why such massive efforts failed. The biggest problem was the uncertainty about the aircraft's final location. New information from satellite data analysis, suspicious debris sightings, and possible underwater locator beacon signals kept changing the search area. These constant changes made planning and resource allocation difficult. Search technology had its limits too. Radar couldn't cope with rough seas. Infrared detection didn't work because debris matched the water's temperature. and poor visibility often stopped visual searches. Ocean currents created another problem by moving debris around. Even when teams spotted floating debris, they needed to trace its path backward to find the crash site. The region's complex ocean currents made this task prone to errors. The underwater search covered 120,000 square kilometers of seafloor in the southern Indian Ocean. The cost reached about 200 million Australian dollars, 143 million US dollars. Malaysia, Australia, and China announced they would stop searching in January 2017 after 3 years with no results. Ocean Infinity tried one more time in 2018 with a no-find, no-fee contract. They searched 112,000 square kilometers north of the original area, but found nothing by May 2018. After 11 years, MH370 was still a mystery, a painful one. But then, out of nowhere, a group of researchers made a discovery that brought the entire world's attention back to the case. We're breaking it all down, piece by piece. So whatever you do, don't skip ahead and don't click away, because what you'll see in the final minutes of this video might be the answer we've all been waiting for. What scientists were really looking for. It's crazy is that even with all the technology in the world, satellites, sonar, search teams, and all kinds of scientific tools, nobody has fully cracked the case. The Indian Ocean is massive, like really massive. And the truth is, beneath all that water lies clues that could finally tell us what really happened. But the question is, can they find them in time? Or have they already disappeared forever? Now, the biggest thing the search teams were obsessed with from day one was finding the black boxes. And funny enough, they're not even black. They're actually bright orange. Can you imagine that? Everyone calls them black boxes, but they're painted neon orange so they can be seen easily underwater. The plane had 2 of them, by the way. One was the Flight Data Recorder, FDR, which basically keeps track of all the technical stuff like speed, altitude, engine power, basically everything the plane was doing. The second was the Cockpit Voice Recorder, CVR, and that one captures the conversations and sounds in the cockpit. But here's the frustrating part. The voice recorder only stores the last 2 hours of audio. So, if something sketchy happened earlier in the flight, like when the plane first turned unexpectedly westward, we wouldn't even hear that part. I mean, how is that even helpful? And then came the shocking bit. In a 2015 report, they discovered something no one wanted to hear. The battery on the flight data recorder's underwater locator beacon had expired. Like, it had literally died over a year before the plane even went missing. Can you imagine? That tiny little battery was supposed to send out signals, these little underwater pings, for 30 days so searchers could find the wreckage. But with a dead battery, that thing was basically silent. They could have been flying search equipment right over the crash site and never even know it. I mean, how does that even happen on a plane that's supposed to be constantly maintained and double-checked? Luckily, the cockpit voice recorder still had a working beacon, so not all hope was lost. But still, it was a huge setback. The whole search was like trying to find a needle in the world's biggest haystack, underwater. They used all sorts of high-tech tools, like towed pinger locators and autonomous underwater vehicles, basically robot submarines. At one point, an Australian ship called the Ocean Shield actually picked up 2 promising pings. One was super deep, 3,000 meters down, and it lasted over 2 hours. The second was shallower, around 300 meters, and it went on for 13 minutes. That gave everyone hope. They immediately launched an underwater vehicle called the Bluefin 21 to scan the area. It made 30 dives and covered over 816 square kilometers of ocean floor. Imagine how huge that is. And you know what they found? Nothing. Turns out, those pings didn't come from the plane after all. They don't even know what caused them. Can you imagine how crushing that must have been for the teams out there? So when that lead went cold, scientists had to get creative. They started focusing on the ocean itself, its currents, its patterns, and how things drift over time. That's when they got their first solid clue, In July 2015, a piece of the plane's wing, called a flaperon, washed up on Reunion Island. That was 16 months after the plane disappeared. Finally, they had something real. Scientists jumped on that like detectives at a crime scene. Oceanographers began creating drift models, trying to work backward. They used wind data, ocean current maps, and debris movement to trace where the flaperon might have come from. And then, guess what? Marine biologists came in clutch with a totally different kind of clue. Barnacles. Yep, barnacles that had grown on the flaperon. Sounds random, right? But barnacles are little scientists in their own way. These things grow in layers, and the chemistry in those layers tells you what kind of water they were in while they grew, like temperature, depth, and even movement. They analyzed the biggest barnacles and realized they'd only been growing for 4 months. But wait, the plane had been missing for 16 months. So either the debris was trapped underwater for a while and only floated up recently, or it came from a crash site much closer than people thought. Either way, it made things even more confusing. But hold on, it gets even darker. Just when people were starting to think they might never learn anything new, another piece of debris showed up. It was found in Madagascar and turned out to be a trunnion door from the plane's landing gear. And the damage to it? Honestly, it was chilling. Investigators found evidence that the engines had blown inward through the component. That means the landing gear was down, on purpose, when the plane hit the ocean. Why does that matter? Because if the pilot wanted to crash gently, they'd keep the gear up. But dropping the landing gear like that creates drag and tears things apart faster. It suggests the crash wasn't accidental at all. Some experts believe it was done to make sure the plane broke apart quickly and sank fast, taking the truth with it. Isn't that just haunting to think about? The emotional toll on families and investigators. You know, sometimes a headline just hits you for a second and then disappears from your mind. But behind that headline, especially one like MH370, there's this deep, gut-wrenching, totally human story that just never ends for the people involved. That's exactly what families of the passengers on MH370 have been going through. We're talking about a decade of raw, aching silence, living in this weird, heartbreaking space between hope and acceptance, and constantly being pulled back and forth between the two like some emotional tug of war. Take Li Eryu, for instance. He's this Chinese farmer whose only son was on that flight, and every single day since the plane vanished, he's been keeping track, literally. He has this board in his home where he counts the days. And get this, he's written almost 2,000 poems just to cope. Can you even imagine? 2,000 little pieces of heartbreak on paper. He said those words are the only thing keeping him alive, the only thing that helps him breathe. I mean, doesn't that just punch you in the chest? And he's not the only one living in this endless state of waiting. So many family members are stuck in this in-between space. They can't even start the grieving process properly because there's still that tiny sliver of maybe. Grace Nathan, whose mom was on the flight, says it perfectly. There's this emotional gap that just never got bridged. No answers, no closure, just a giant question mark where a person used to be. Then there's Jaquita Gonzalez, who lost her husband, Patrick. She still hasn't had a memorial for him. Why? Because how do you say goodbye when you don't even have proof that the person is truly gone? All she wants is for the plane to be found, just so she can finally let her husband rest in peace. Honestly, is that really too much to ask? And let's talk about the money part for a second. You'd think at least the financial stuff would be handled properly, right? But no. Some people like Zhang Hui, who lost his mom on the flight, actually ended up losing even more. He left his job as an IT manager and sold his house just so he could dedicate himself full-time to advocating for the families and pushing for the truth. He spent tens of thousands of yuan trying to chase answers that probably should have come from officials in the first place. And sure, Malaysia Airlines offered settlements to families, but a lot of people didn't take it. Because, let's be real, how do you put a price tag on a loved one? And for many, accepting the money felt like being told to shut up and move on. Can you imagine that? Like, here's some cash. Now stop asking questions. Who wouldn't be insulted? And you know, culture plays a huge role in how people grieve too. For someone like Lee, coming from a traditional Chinese background, finding his son's body isn't just about closure, it's about duty. It's what a parent is supposed to do. There was this moment, so heartbreaking I can't even say it without tearing up a little, where Lee stood near the Indian Ocean and just shouted out loud that he had come to take his son home. No plane, no answers, just a father calling out to the sea, hoping it would finally let go of his child. And even though Malaysian families have different traditions, that pain, that desperate ache, it's the same. Experts call this kind of suffering ambiguous loss, and honestly, that term barely scratches the surface of what these people are going through. It's that feeling of being stuck, like time froze the moment the plane vanished. Psychologists say people in this kind of limbo hold on to hope for years, sometimes forever, and that hope, as beautiful as it is, can also trap you. Because you can't really grieve someone you still think might be alive. You can't move forward while one part of your heart keeps whispering, "What if?" The shocking discovery. After 11 years. For more than 10 years, scientists and investigators have been trying to piece together the mystery of what really happened to Flight MH370, and honestly, the more they find, the more chilling it all gets. You know how most plane crashes are explained within weeks or months? Not this one. With MH370, the main wreckage is still completely missing, like vanished. So these poor investigators have had to work like detectives, building a case from scattered scraps. And when I say scraps, I mean literal pieces of debris washing up on distant shores like ghostly breadcrumbs. It's the kind of thing that gives you goosebumps just thinking about it. So far, they've collected over 30 pieces of what they think might be parts of the plane. Most of them found along African coastlines or washed up on islands in the Indian Ocean. But guess how many pieces they could actually confirm with 100% certainty belong to MH370? Just 3. Yep, 3 out of 30 plus. And all 3 are wing parts. The first big clue came in July 2015, over a year after the plane went missing, when a flaperon was found on Reunion Island. Can you imagine the feeling of seeing that chunk of a plane and knowing it belonged to MH370? They were able to match it to manufacturing records using the part's ID number, and that was the first real, solid evidence anyone had seen since the plane vanished. Then later, a wing flap was found in Tanzania, and another wing piece turned up in Mauritius. But even with those discoveries, the bigger question remained. What actually happened to the plane? Here's where things start getting eerie. When the scientists dug into the details, they discovered that the aircraft's controls had likely been deliberately manipulated, like someone manually changed its course. That right there ruled out theories about a mechanical malfunction or an accidental crash. A massive 495-page report released in July 2018 confirmed that someone had likely intentionally redirected the plane. And that changed everything. It made the situation feel so much darker and more personal, like this wasn't just an accident, it might have been a plan. And wait, it gets weirder. Back in February 2016, some debris pieces had these strange marks on them. People thought they might be burn marks. Now, that would have suggested a fire or explosion on board, right? But when the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board checked them out, they found it was just resin discoloration. No fire, no explosion, just markings. That sort of sums up this whole investigation, honestly. Every time they think they've cracked something, it turns out to be a dead end, or even more confusing than before. Now here's where the real jaw-dropping detail comes in. Scientists looked closely at one particular part, the aircraft's landing gear trunnion door, and found that something had pierced through it from the inside. Can you imagine that? Engines literally disintegrating during impact and tearing through the structure. That alone is terrifying. But even more telling was the fact that the landing gear was extended during the crash. And that's not something a pilot ever does when landing on water. It actually increases the risk of the plane flipping or breaking apart. So the fact that the landing gear was out, it told scientists that whoever was in control wasn't trying to land safely. They were trying to destroy the aircraft as quickly as possible. Like fully crash it. High-speed dive, full impact, no survivors, no trace. It's just so chilling. But even with all that science, data, and analysis, there's still this huge, painful gap in the narrative, that missing wreckage. Without it, they just can't close the case. The people working on this, scientists, aviation experts, even oceanographers, have all admitted that until the main body of the plane is found, everything else is still just a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.